Perfect, thank you.
Hey, how are you? How are you? I think I'm going to start, just because it's... Sure. This hearing of the China Congressional Executive Commission on China will come to order. The title is One City, Two Legal Systems, Political Prisoners and the Erosion of the Rule of Law in Hong Kong. And I want to thank all of our distinguished witnesses for being here and for their leadership that is every single day, 24/7, 365 days a year. And I just can't thank you enough for that leadership. It inspires all of us to do more. So thank you again for that leadership. Let me just give us a few opening comments and yield to my distinguished colleagues for any comments that they would like to make as well. This is an important hearing focusing on political prisoners in Hong Kong and how the rule of law has eroded substantially in just the past several years, accelerating since the introduction of the National Security Law in June of 2020, a law that was introduced not by Hong Kong's legislature, but imposed by the National People's Congress Standing Committee in Beijing. That fact tells you how false the one country, two systems mantra has turned out to be. For we no longer have the rule of law in Hong Kong, but the rule by law, and I would say by unjust law, by laws that are imposed upon the people of Hong Kong by their communist overlords in Beijing. Of course, as our witness Kevin Yam points out in his written testimony, we still see lawyers and judges, quote, who decked out in their British-style wigs and gowns, close quote, but the common law inheritance, which was referenced in Article 8 of the governing basic law of Hong Kong, has been destroyed, notwithstanding the residual pomp and ceremony. It is all just Gilbert and Sullivan-esque play acting, the model of modern Major General having been replaced by the Lord High Executioner. For now, the outcome of trials for violation of the national security law are a foregone conclusion, with the Secretary for Security, Chris Tang, boasting just last month of a 100% conviction rate in cases concerning the national security. And what are these violations of the national security law? Consider the case of Hong Kong University student Liu Xingyu, who pled guilty to a charge of incitement to secession for running an instant messaging channel that advocated Hong Kong independence. He was sentenced by the district court judge Amanda Woodcock to 5.5 years in prison for the violation of the NSL, being saying that this was a serious nature. To add insult to injury, Liu pled guilty to benefit from the common law practice of reducing a sentence by 1/3 if the defendant pleads guilty. While the judge initially sought to comply with that precedent, the prosecution objected, and the judge only shaved 6 months off the sentence. In other words, a 5-year prison sentence for a university student engaging in free speech. Amanda Woodcock was also the trial judge who sentenced Jimmy Lai, whose son Sebastian we shall hear from today, and we're just honored to have you here, for inciting others, she said, to knowingly participate in a banned Tiananmen Square anniversary vigil. This, of course, is separate from the 5-year, 9-month lawfare sentence he was already serving, which Sebastian can tell us more about in a few moments, or his upcoming trial for sedition under the national security law. There should be consequences for judges like Amanda Woodcock, who are complicit in the dismantling of the rule of law in Hong Kong and who bow to the dictates of the Chinese Communist Party. Here, an excellent report on the role played by Hong Kong judges in rights violations under the national security law, which I encourage everyone to read. Just as we have sanctioned so-called judges in Venezuela and Iran for their undermining of constitutional government and participating in show trials, so too should someone like Amanda Woodcock, who is a judge in name only, be sanctioned for undermining the rule of law and indeed the judiciary. Another judge who should be sanctioned, in my opinion, is District Court Judge Kwok Wai-kin. Judge Kwok was the judge who sentenced 5 speech therapists to 19 months in prison for publishing 3 allegorical children's books about sheep being harmed by wolves, and that was with seditious intent. This is shocking. There's actually one item in the judge's sentence that I actually agree with. However, when the defendants sought to argue that one country, two systems meant that a distinction exists between the People's Republic of China and Hong Kong, Judge Kwok berated them, saying, morally wrong to say that Hong Kong and PRC are separate. In this, Judge Kwok was correct. The distinction between the PRC and Hong Kong has been obliterated. This is the reason why I've introduced in the House, along with Ranking Member McGovern and Senator Rubio and Senator Merkley, our co-chair of this commission, and the 2 ranking members as well, the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Office Certification Act, or H.R. 1103. I see no reason why the Chinese Communist Party and Communist China should have 3 additional consular outposts in the United States, as Hong Kong no longer is distinct from the mainland. Indeed, as our witness Anna Kwok will testify, these economic and trade offices are collecting information about members of her group, the Hong Kong Democracy Council, and other democracy activists. Thus, I call on my colleagues to join as co-sponsors of 1103 And I ask that a letter from the various Hong Kong NGOs calling for markup and passage of H.R. 1103 be entered to the record at this point. Without objection, so ordered. Finally, I would note that American businesses have now been put on notice that the rule of law in Hong Kong is dead. Just as mainland China has political prisoners such as Guo Fei-xiong, who incidentally is facing a sham trial for subversion of state power, Ding Zhixi and Gao Zhejiang, and I've chaired 3 hearings, one with Gao's daughter, Grace, and 2 with his wife. The way that man has been maltreated as a defense attorney is an abomination to all things good and honorable, and brings dishonor to the Chinese Communist Party, as so many of their actions do. But that one is in particular especially egregious. And of course, we are speaking out as strongly and as consistently in a totally bipartisan way for heroic political prisoners like Jimmy Lai, Gwyneth Ho, and Cho Hang-tung. And if you think the businesses in China are not on the next target, just look across the border and see what happened 2 weeks ago to Bain & Company, whose offices were raided by Chinese authorities in Shanghai. We, too, are going to look closely at the actions of the American companies like PayPal and Stripe, which, as one of our witnesses will testify, are terminating services to pro-democracy groups in Hong Kong. We want to ask them why. And we are also going to look at the role played by TikTok in interfering with the advertising and playing of the documentary, The Hong Konger, Jimmy Lai's Extraordinary Struggle for Freedom. This episode was detailed in a written statement submitted by Father Robert Sirico of the Acton Institute, a man I've known for about 30 years, who was also a great leader for human rights. And I asked it to be entered into the record, along with the submission by Sunny Chung, one of the members of the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation, and also one of the lawyers for Jimmy Lai. So I want to thank my colleagues for being here, and I want to thank especially our witnesses, and I'd like to yield, yes, to Ms. Salinas for any opening comments.
Thank you, Chairman Smith and Co-Chair Merkley. I'm honored to be appointed to the Congressional Executive Commission on China for the 118th Congress, and I really do look forward to this opportunity to work with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle on comprehensive whole government approaches to support global cooperation while defending fundamental human rights and democracy. I am deeply concerned by the ongoing attacks of free speech and democracy in Hong Kong. The government's practice of bringing false and politically motivated charges against Hong Kong residents is an appalling subversion of international legal standards. And I thank the witnesses here today for coming before the Commission to share their experiences to help us consider effective measures to counter threats to the rule of law in Hong Kong. Sadly, I will not be able to stay for the entire hearing. I have to leave for a markup in another committee. But I have already read your statements. I will go back and actually watch the hearing testimony. So I would appreciate if one or more of the witnesses might reflect and consider on how recent U.S. competitiveness policies might relate to human rights in Hong Kong. As you all likely know, Congress recently passed substantial investments in domestic technology and green energy manufacturing, much of which is aimed at actually bringing industrial capacity back to the U.S. and reducing economic dependence, and how that might factor into our efforts to continue to champion political freedom and the rule of law in Hong Kong. Once again, I am so grateful to be serving on the Commission, and I look forward to working closely with my colleagues to defend human rights and democracy, and I thank you.
Ms. Salinas was just Commissioner, so happy to have you on the Commission, and I look forward to working with you going forward. Thank you. I'd like to now yield to a distinguished man who served as a cabinet member for the Department of Interior, Ryan Zinke. So glad to have you here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I think we recognize China for what it is. China, just we can take any avenue if we want to take on the Pacific as a former secretary, just on the egregious pollution aspect of it. They're the world's largest emitter of pollution. 90% of the world's plastics comes from 4 rivers in China. They're the world's largest violator of fishing rights. And then you turn to any country that promotes human trafficking and organ harvesting is evil. I don't know what other term you can say it. But I think these committee hearings are important, a lot of it to expose. And you have personal stories, and I'm very interested in hearing your remarks on a personal, because this is what the House does, along with the Senate. Here's for it, and then thinks about what action we need to take as a Congress. And we can take action. The House is the power of the purse. And to a degree, the power of the purse dictates actions in our government. So together, this is a bipartisan issue. I'm proud to be a part of this commission because I think it's an important topic. China is fast becoming our adversary. I don't think they're quite there yet, but the road and consequences of global adversaries at this scale is far-reaching. At the core of it is freedom. We should never forget why we're here. It is about freedom. It's about democracy. And I'll go back to one of our greatest presidents, I would say John F. Kennedy, and his remarkable statements that we will pay any price, we will bear any cost to ensure the survival and success of liberty and our freedom. And that extends to our allies and friends. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm anxious to hear the witnesses' statements.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Zinke. I just would note that Daniel Sudani from the Solomon Islands has just come in, and welcome. He briefed the CECC a couple of weeks ago on the long arm of China's transnational repression in his Pacific Island nation. Disturbingly, his GoFundMe account to pay for his trip to warn Congress and the American people was blocked until word got out that he would be appearing before the CECC. Nonetheless, we are going to look at why GoFundMe would freeze his account, hopefully without having to use our subpoena authority, which we will use if they don't cooperate. So welcome and thank you for being here. I'd like to now introduce our very distinguished witnesses. Let me note parenthetically that Co-Chair Merkley is on his way. Over on the Senate side, they had some pressing business that he had to attend to, but he will be here. He's ever faithful and a great leader, so he'll be here very momentarily. I would like to welcome our panelists for today's very important hearing. Let me begin by introducing Sebastian Lai. He is the living martyr, Jimmy Lai, and this is his son, someone who is more than just a very, very great son to his dad, but a man who has is exceptionally articulate in advocating on behalf not only of his father, but on behalf of all of the people of Hong Kong. He is truly remarkable. He is leading the International Free Jimmy Lai campaign to secure his father's release. Like his media entrepreneur father, who founded Next Digital and Apple Daily, the popular independent Chinese language newspaper in Hong Kong, which was forcibly shut down by the Hong Kong authorities in 2021, Sebastian has become an advocate for civil liberty in general and freedom of the press in particular. In December 2021, Sebastian accepted the award of the 2021 WAN IFRA Golden Pen of Freedom on behalf of his father and the newsroom staff of the Apple Daily Hong Kong. On receiving the award, he said, and I quote, "Less and less people are shining a light in these dark corners, given Apple Daily's shutdown and the ongoing crackdown on journalism in the region." Sebastian is here with us today to shine that light brightly. We welcome him. Your father is in our prayers. He could have left Hong Kong at any time, but so loyal was he to the people of Hong Kong and to the cause of freedom and press freedom in particular, that he just stayed, knowing that there was a very potentially ominous future facing him. Next is Brian Kern. Welcome. Who is an American citizen and a Hong Kong permanent resident. He has been involved in the Hong Kong democracy movement for 15 years and has written 3 books about its history over the past decade. One was about the umbrella movement, one about the period from 2014 to 2018, and the most recent about the 2019 to 2020 protests. He and his family left Hong Kong in 2020 and moved back to the United States. He now works with various Hong Kong pro-democracy groups in the diaspora. He has monitored politically motivated arrests, prosecutions, and imprisonments in Hong Kong since the summer of 2019. He is a lead researcher on Hong Kong Democracy Council's June 2022 report on political prisoners in Hong Kong, which has been very, very useful tool to us on this commission. So thank you for guiding us with that kind of very actionable and incredible information. Really appreciate it, Brian. And then we'll hear from, is Kevin? Kevin's going to be by remote. Kevin Yan, who's a senior fellow at the Georgetown University Center for Asian Law, and he will be joining us remotely from Australia. Kevin was born in Hong Kong, raised in Australia, and spent nearly 2 decades working in Hong Kong. Before his return to Australia in 2022, he was a lawyer with international firms and worked on white-collar crimes, financial regulatory investigations, and commercial litigation. Beyond his day job, Kevin was a rule of law and democracy activist, serving variously as a member of the Hong Kong Law Society's Constitutional Affairs and Human Rights Committee and a founding co-convener of the now defunct Hong Kong Progressive Lawyers Group. Since returning to Australia, he has resumed his Hong Kong advocacy efforts, meeting with various members of the Australian Parliament and current Australian Foreign Minister. He is a regular interviewee with Australian international media outlets in Hong Kong and on China issues in Hong Kong, including commenting on the ongoing political prosecutions in Hong Kong. Over the years, Kevin has published commentaries with outlets such as The Economist, ABC Australia, Apple Daily, and later being obviously the paper run by Jimmy Lai. Finally, we'll hear from Anna Kawak, who is the executive director of the Hong Kong Democracy Council, a leading nonpartisan nonprofit organization for Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement and Hong Kongers in the United States. Under Anna's leadership, HKDC advances Hong Kongers' fight for basic human rights through policy advocacy, diaspora empowerment, and research and education. And again, we rely on your input and information. It is just extraordinary. HKDC actively monitors all documents and documents the plight of the political prisoners, as well as Hong Kong's government attempts to influence American businesses and foreign policies. The organization is sanctioned and censored by the PRC, and we welcome to the club, but thank you that you are doing such a tremendous job. During Hong Kong's 2019 protests, Anna was an anonymous activist behind major international campaigns, from publicly pleading with global leaders to stand with Hong Kong at the G20 summit, to broadcasting real-time police locations for on-the-ground protesters. Anna helped actualize a decentralized grassroots movement that continues to this day. In 2022, 2 years after the enactment of the national security law, Anna decided to publicize her identity and personal story in defiance of the widespread fear gripping Hong Kongers abroad. Again, may your courage inspire others, Anna, and thank you for being here. We are joined by Michelle Steele. I'm just advised by who's on the line. Michelle, Commissioner Steele, if you have any comments you'd like to make before we go to Sebastian. Thank you. I'd like to now recognize, for such time as he may consume, Sebastian Lai.
My name is Sebastian Lai, and my father is Jimmy Lai, the media owner, publisher, writer, and pro-democracy campaigner. My father faces life in prison for publishing the truth, and he is a prisoner of conscience. Thank you very much for the strong statement and inspirational work that you and all of you, sirs and madams, have been doing, and this committee has been doing. I also want to thank the Congressional Executive Commission on China for nominating my father and 5 others for the Nobel Peace Prize. This nomination has touched me deeply, and my family are very grateful for it. A brief word on my father's background. Born in 1948, his family lost everything when the communists took power. As a child of 12, he fled China for a better life in Hong Kong. He started out as a manual laborer, but went on to own his own clothing firm, Giordano, and saw global success as a result. My father became one of Hong Kong's most successful entrepreneurs. My father is a proud British citizen. He is also a Christian, a devout Catholic, and his faith gives him strength. He deeply believes in freedom, civil liberties, and human rights. It was these values that inspired him to start the newspaper Apple Daily, because he said, without free and independent information, there is no freedom. Apple Daily quickly grew to be the largest and most popular Chinese newspaper in Hong Kong, Chinese language newspaper in Hong Kong. It was known for its independent journalism and its anti-corruption and pro-democracy stance. At its peak, it had 8 million unique page views a day and 4,000 employees. As soon as my father began in media, he stood up to China, and China's leader targeted him for it. First, he was effectively forced to sell Giordano, after the CCP threatened to close down all the stores in mainland China. Then his business and our family home were firebombed. He was spied on, and he and our family were followed. His advertisers were targeted, and he was threatened financially. But their tactics did not work, and Apple Daily kept publishing. And then it got worse. As the pro-democracy protests swept Hong Kong, the authority crushed my father's business and put him in prison. Soon after, Apple Daily was raided by 500 police officers and has since been forced to close. Its assets were frozen, his employees lost their jobs, and his business was destroyed. My father is in prison for telling the truth. He has faced what can only be described as lawfare. He was first sentenced to prison for lighting a candle at a vigil to commemorate the Tiananmen Square massacre. Then he faced spurious fraud charges over alleged breach of an office lease. He was sentenced for 5 years and 9 months in prison, when any jail time is unheard of in a commercial lease matter. This should send a chill down the spine of any business owner in Hong Kong. Now he faces life in prison for alleged crimes of sedition and crimes under the controversial national security law. These ludicrous charges are based on his writing and other material published in Apple Daily. For this, he faces life in prison. His trial is in September, but the outcome is a foregone conclusion. The security minister boasts that they have a 100% conviction rate in these cases. We expect he will face a lengthy sentence and possibly life in prison. This could mean I never see my father again. Because I speak out for my father, I can't return to Hong Kong to visit him in prison. He is 75 years old, so a long sentence will see him die behind bars. The authorities are cracking down hard on my father to send a message to him and others. Dissent will not be tolerated. There is no freedom of press. There's no rule of law. The case against my father symbolizes just how broken the legal system is in Hong Kong. And it should be a warning to all business people that it is not business as usual in Hong Kong. We have started the Free Jimmy Lai campaign to call for his immediate release and freedom. We need your help, and we need the help of the UK and US government. I thank the Commission for condemning the unlawful actions against my father. I also thank the United States government for the strong stance it has taken against my father's ongoing persecution. I am, however, disappointed that our own country, the United Kingdom, has not taken a stronger stance. To this day, the UK government has not condemned what happened to my father or even called for his release. I am alarmed by this. My father is a British citizen. I am a British citizen. Why won't the British government call for his release? I implore the US and UK government to support my campaign to free my father. In conclusion, I am proud my father stood up to China and stood up for democracy in Hong Kong. I ask that the United States government continue to do all it can to secure my father's freedom and to hold the CCP and the Hong Kong authorities accountable for his ongoing persecution. Thank you very much.
Mr. Lai, thank you so very much for your very eloquent and strong statement. I'd like to now yield to Mr. Kern for such time he may consume.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, I appear before you today as both a citizen of the United States and a permanent resident of Hong Kong. I express my deep appreciation for the CECC's consistent work on Hong Kong over the years. So many members of Congress on both sides of the aisle, as well as the administration, are important allies in the Hong Kong people's struggle for freedom and democracy, and that is most heartening. I am here to speak with you about the crisis of mass political imprisonment in Hong Kong. It is an essential part of the overall ongoing crackdown, the systematic suppression of human rights, and the Chinese Communist Party's transformation of Hong Kong into an authoritarian society. Over the years, I worked for many pro-democracy civil society groups and political parties in Hong Kong. All of them have been shut down, and their leaders are now in prison. Lei Cheqian, Cao Angtong, Albert Ho, Lung Kwa Kong, Benny Tai, Joshua Wong, Eddie Chu, Jeremy Tam, Kwok Ka-ki, and Alvin Yeung. Three of them, as the chair noted, Lei Cheqian, Cao Angtong, and Joshua Wong have deservedly been nominated for this year's Nobel Peace Prize, along with Jimmy Lai, Gwyneth Ho, and Cardinal Zen. In all, more than 80 groups associated with the pro-democracy movement have been forced to close. 188 pro-democracy leaders have been arrested, 109 convicted, and 46 imprisoned. Dozens are in long-term pre-trial detention. You have to look hard around the world to find countries where the political opposition has been so systematically and drastically targeted for elimination as Hong Kong. But it's not just leaders of the pro-democracy movement who are in prison. In fact, they make up a minority. Most political prisoners are ordinary Hong Kongers. University and high school students, medical workers, emergency first aiders, lawyers, teachers, business people, journalists, people from across the pro-democracy spectrum, from the most moderate to the most radical. The oldest political prisoner is Jimmy Lai, at 75 years old. The youngest is 13. He was just convicted last week. Mass political imprisonment affects virtually every sector of Hong Kong society, every community, every neighborhood. Most everyone in Hong Kong knows someone imprisoned for political reasons. Just this year, my neighbor, a young devout Christian musician, was sentenced to more than 4 years in prison for taking part in a protest in 2019. I was at that protest. I was about 200 yards away from him when he got arrested. Millions of us all stood up for freedom and democracy, but some are paying for that much more heavily than others. In 2020, on the eve of the imposition of the draconian national security law, my own family decided to leave Hong Kong while we believed we still could. Refuge in this country has afforded me the opportunity to fight on for Hong Kong. Being free myself, I have a special responsibility to all those who are not free, and above all, to political prisoners. I think I speak for most Hong Kongers when I say we have a strong awareness that it could just as easily be any one of us in prison. The people who are there are serving time on our behalf. We have great gratitude for and solidarity with them, and we will fight until every political prisoner is free, however long that may be. I started monitoring political arrests a few weeks after the beginning of the protests in 2019, as it became clear that the regime would employ mass arrests as a tactic to crush the protests, and I've continued to do so ever since. From June 2019 until now, there have been 10,615 political arrests in Hong Kong. I was the lead researcher on the Hong Kong Democracy Council's report on political prisoners, which came out in June 2022, a year ago, just a little bit more than a year ago. It's based on a complete database which is continually updated. One of our main motivations in publishing the report was to emphasize the very large number of political prisoners. The international media has done a pretty good job of covering the trials of high-profile figures such as Jimmy Lai, Joshua Wong, and some others, but there's been little reporting on this pattern of mass political imprisonment. The report's cutoff date was May 11, 2022, exactly 1 year ago today. At that time, there were 1,014 political prisoners in Hong Kong. Now, 1 year later, the number has risen to 1,459. That's 445 new political prisoners in 1 year, an increase of close to 50%. Let me put that in global perspective. The only countries incarcerating political prisoners at rates faster than Hong Kong's over the past 3 years are Burma and Belarus, hardly beacons of rule of law. This is what makes what's happening in Hong Kong all the more extraordinary. Unlike Belarus and Burma, up until 2019, despite its lack of democracy, Hong Kong had fairly robust rule of law. There are few better indicators of the deterioration of rule of law and the erosion of the independence of the judiciary than the huge increase in the number of political prisoners. Political imprisonment per se isn't an entirely new phenomenon in Hong Kong, but mass political imprisonment is. At the start of the protests in June 2019, there were 26 political prisoners. We've gone from 26 then to 1,014 in May 2022 to 1,459 today. Who are these political prisoners? There are basically three categories. One, protesters from the 2019-2020 protests. Two, those remanded and imprisoned on national security law charges. And three, those remanded and imprisoned on sedition charges. Of those three groups, by far the largest is protesters. About 1,300 people have been imprisoned on protest-related charges versus 116 on national security law and sedition charges. Young people have been particularly targeted. 159 political prisoners are minors. That's about 10% of the overall total. 70% of political prisoners are under the age of 30. I call the young people of Hong Kong today the prison generation. Oppression is one of their most defining experiences. We expect the number of political prisoners will continue to rise for some time to come. There are around 500 whose trials have not concluded or not even begun. On top of that, there are new arrests happening all the time. A conservative estimate is that the number of political prisoners will plateau at around 2,000 sometime next year. That's assuming there are no new waves of mass arrests. What can the United States do? At this point, I'm cognizant of the time. I have some remarks prepared in response to that question, but perhaps it's best for me to pause here. And if you'd like to hear them, I'd be happy to share them during the question and answer portion of the session. They can also be found in my written testimony. Thank you, commissioners, for your support of the Hong Kong people's ongoing struggle for freedom and democracy.
Mr. Curtin, thank you very much for not just your testimony, but above all for the work you're doing. You know, I have many heroes in the human rights movement, and certainly Jimmy Lai is one of them, and Joshua Wong, and so many others. But in the Soviet Union, it was Natan Sharansky. And he said famously, and I actually went to the camp where he was in the 1980s, Perm Camp 35. And he said, if you don't chronicle, you can't fight it. And you're doing a great job for all of us in chronicling these abuses. So we really know the parameters, how many, and you know, the idea of a prison generation is just appalling. Brings dishonor, frankly, to Xi Jinping and his leaders. We're joined by Commissioner Jennifer Wexton. Jennifer, want to wait to the questions? Okay. Thank you. I'd like to now introduce Kevin Yan, who's again coming in to us remotely from Australia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, all the commissioners present today. This is a great opportunity for us to be able to talk about what is going on in Hong Kong. Now, the reality is this: there are other lawyers around that are probably much more qualified than I am to talk about what is going on in Hong Kong and the situation with political prisoners and so on. Unfortunately, a lot of them are currently in jail. And of those who are not in jail or in exile, they're too afraid to speak. They have family in Hong Kong, they have other connections in Hong Kong. And in that sense, I'm a little bit different because I've got no close family in Hong Kong anymore. I even brought my mum's ashes back from Hong Kong when I left the city and went back to Australia. So from that angle, I guess I'm fairly qualified in that I have done some criminal law. I've done a lot of activism over the years, but at the same time, I'm the most available. So look, I've prepared a fairly mild written submission for the commission to consider. But I think the most important thing is this: if you go around and ask the various judges in Hong Kong, they'll think that they're behaving in a way that is completely independent. They think that no one's tapping them on the shoulder or anything like that. If you go and watch trials in Hong Kong, you'll see all of them still in their wigs and gowns. You'll see all the legal jargon being used, lots of drawn-out trials. It's easy to hoodwink people who want to believe that Hong Kong is well when it comes to the rule of law. But actually, everything's pretty rotten to the core. And actually, these judges do not live in a vacuum. They can see that their Chief Justice is no longer willing to publicly defend separation of powers, that the Chief Justice has reinstated Judge Kwok, who Mr. Chairman had talked about earlier, who's actually a disgraced judge, but he's reinstated him. And they've seen the Chief Justice turn up to party political events like Communist Party 100th anniversary commemorations. And worse still, what they've really seen is that whenever they show a little bit of backbone, they'll be rounded on by pro-Beijing forces and even by pro-Beijing officials themselves. So we've heard Sebastian Lai's testimony and what happened with Jimmy Lai. The thing is, Jimmy Lai tried to get a foreign lawyer into Hong Kong to represent him because there are very few local lawyers available who's willing and able to do that. In fact, the Hong Kong courts tried to show a little bit of backbone on that case by letting that foreign lawyer in. But what then happened? The chief executive immediately went to Beijing and seek a reinterpretation. And at the same time, all these Beijing officials rounded on the judges for adopting so-called international values that all of us would take for granted. And then when the interpretation came and the judges were being overridden, the judiciary actually had to humiliate itself once more by issuing a further statement saying, oh, we really respect what the National People's Congress has done. Now, that's like essentially being punched in the gut, and then you still have to smile along and thank the thug for punching you. So the judges are not living in a vacuum. They know who's buttering their bread. They know that by obeying, they're going to have better survival and promotion prospects. So even when they convince themselves that they're operating completely independently, in practice, the results can pretty much only go one way, and that is against all the political defendants. And in a way, that actually makes things worse than mainland China, because at least in mainland China, there's no pretense. You get these brutally short trials and then no justice at all, and everyone can see that or actually be hidden from it. But in Hong Kong, they go through this whole drawn-out pretense, long trials that go on half a year, and there's just even more pain for the political prisoners concerned. Now, I'd just like to go very quickly to the question of prosecutors. Look, sometimes there are arguments that when prosecutors in political cases are doing these things, they are just doing their jobs, that they are just feeding family, getting paid, going through the motions. Unfortunately, that's not what they're doing. What they're really doing, they're not prosecuting, they're persecuting. They've breached all the international and local standards of prosecutorial fairness. They would indiscriminately go against bail applications of any political defendant. They would go after juveniles. You know, they even, like with pro-Beijing figures, talk about possibly bringing Jimmy Lai over to China for trial. Now, what I would say is this, I mean, when it comes to things like what should we do with these people, it's not easy. But I would invite the Commission to ask yourself this question. Do you think their conduct make you, quote unquote, puke? And I use this word not lightly because it actually came from Oliver Wendell Holmes, who said that you should uphold laws unless those laws make you puke. Now, I would say that people of conscience would find that those operating as prosecutors, as well as some of the judges, are behaving in biased and unfair ways that should make everyone puke. And with that, I would happily take questions on recommendations and other issues about the rule of law, especially in the business sector. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Yan. Deeply appreciate your testimony and for coming to us. Before going to Anna, I'd like to recognize and welcome, because I know he was very busy over in the United States Senate, our co-chair, Senator Merkley.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And do we have time for me to give opening remarks? Do so. Thank you. Just came from testifying on a bill on the Senate side, so I'm sorry I wasn't able to join you at the start. Just a few years, Hong Kong has gone from a relatively free and open city to a shadow of its former self. This transformation has not been an accident, but rather a result of the ruthless assault on Hong Kong's spirit by the Chinese Communist Party and its shameless enablers in the Hong Kong government. At every step, this commission has documented that assault, shining a light on the draconian national security law, chronicling the crushing of civil society, and now today releasing a report detailing the erosion of Hong Kong's rule of law. Nowhere is the crisis in Hong Kong's rule of law more vivid and heartbreaking than in an explosion in the number of political prisoners. The Commission's political prisoner database, which has long focused on the many thousands of cases in mainland China, has expanded in recent years to now also include cases in Hong Kong. We've had no choice to do so. We've had a responsibility to do so. As one of our witnesses today informs us, in the last 4 years, there have been 10,615 political arrests in Hong Kong. What had been a relatively free and open city locked up thousands of political prisoners with dizzying speed. That includes icons of free speech like Jimmy Lai and Joshua Wong. But the jailers didn't stop after they made examples of prominent advocates for freedom and democracy. As we'll hear today, this is a story of mass political imprisonment. Hong Kong's rulers want to send that message that nobody who speaks truth to power, protesters, politicians, journalists, or anybody else, is safe. This is devastating for all of us who love Hong Kong. I will never forget Thanksgiving Day 2019, the day after the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act bill banning the export of crowd control equipment to the Hong Kong police was signed into law. 100,000 Hong Kongers held a rally to thank the United States for standing with Hong Kong. They thanked us, these defenders of the soul of Hong Kong, of the freedom of Hong Kong, the political rights of Hong Kong, who were putting so much on the line in the face of determined repression. I had the privilege of addressing that crowd via video that day and remain proud of the work of this commission, what this commission did on a bipartisan, bicameral basis to get those bills signed into law. But what we did is from the safety of the United States, unlike the huge challenge on the ground in Hong Kong. If Hong Kong's freedom fighters can no longer feel safe in Hong Kong, the least we can do, the very least, is to make them feel safe here in the United States. It's disgraceful that we have not done more to open up humanitarian pathways for Hong Kongers to the United States of America. Whether it's Priority 2 refugee protections in the Hong Kong Safe Harbor Act that Senator Rubio introduced last Congress with my support, or other pathways, it's long past time to act. We've shown there's bipartisan support for this cause, bicameral support. We can't let the politics or objections of a few stop us from doing what's right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair Merkley. Again, thank you for your leadership on these initiatives. I'd like to now yield to Anna Kwok for such time as she may consume.
Chairman Smith, Co-Chairman Merkley, and members of the Commission, thank you for inviting me to today's hearing to testify. I was born in Hong Kong in 1997, the year when its sovereignty was handed over from the United Kingdom to China under the promise of basic liberties and a high level of autonomy. I'm now 26 and currently in exile. In less than a quarter century, Hong Kong descended from a beacon of hope for freedom to the product of yet another failed international treaty negotiated with the Chinese Communist Party. Through the years, Hong Kongers did absolutely everything we could, at the ballot, on the streets, in the courts, to defy the odds stacked against us. By June 2020, decades of civil organizing and months of a decentralized protest movement ended with Beijing's decisive gavel, the imposition of the national security law. Soon after, the city turned into a surveillance state, just like China. My friends, who were supposedly anonymous, ended up in prison one by one. Since 2020, both the Trump and Biden administrations have repeatedly acknowledged Hong Kong's loss of its promised autonomy. We must know the international treaty failed at the cost of an ever-rising number of political prisoners. With 1,459 political prisoners and counting, how high does the number have to get for the world to actively hold the Chinese Communist Party accountable and its breach of international treaty accountable? Sure, we are of course not ending the dictatorship right here, right now, but we can and we should at least slow down the oppression and reduce the number of people impacted. Demand the release of Hong Kong political prisoners. Offer humanitarian pathways to the politically persecuted. In the past 2 Congresses, various Hong Kong-related pathway bills have sprung up, but none have passed. Every delayed action is a missed opportunity to embrace allies for a global anti-authoritarian alliance. Therefore, I urge you to work across the aisle to reintroduce a new unified bill that offers humanitarian pathways for Hong Kongers as soon as possible. A priority 2 refugee destination, as Chairman Merkley mentioned, should be considered, so Hong Kongers can seek long-term resettlement to the U.S. in a third country, where vetting procedures can be implemented for security concerns. To strengthen Hong Kongers' activism in the U.S., the current Deferred and Forced Departure program should be upgraded to temporary protected status. Both of these will protect Hong Kong's strongest advocates and demonstrate America's commitment to democratic values around the world. Besides, the Biden administration should further utilize the sanctioning tools in the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act of 2019 and the Hong Kong Autonomy Act of 2020, as endorsed and highlighted by the Commission this morning again, and supported by other advocacy groups, including Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong and Stand with Hong Kong. This November, U.S.-sanctioned Chief Executive of Hong Kong, John Lee, will appear in San Francisco for the APEC summit. The White House should carefully plan for its approach in handling this issue. Here in the U.S., we must also work together to counter foreign influence from the Hong Kong government on American soil and in American entities. The 3 Hong Kong economic and trade offices in D.C., right here, New York, and San Francisco have long enjoyed the same level of privilege as do the United Nations and the World Trade Organization. They exploit their presence and privilege to counter-lobby against pro-democracy legislation right here on Capitol Hill and gather intelligence on team members of the Hong Kong Democracy Council. As someone on the receiving end of transnational repression, I applaud this commission for taking the lead on the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Office Certification Act. Last but not least, 3 other pieces of important legislation merit our attention. The Hong Kong Business Integrity and Transparency Act, recently reintroduced by Congressman Curtis and Congressman Peters, monitor possible human rights abuses facilitated by American corporates that operate in Hong Kong. The Safeguarding Internet Freedom in Hong Kong Act helps Hong Kongers remain connected to the world amid online censorship and control. And a permanent reauthorization of the Protect Hong Kong Act of 2019 ensures that American weapons don't end up in the hands of the Hong Kong police without it being tied up with the annual NDAA process. Despite the grave dangers posed by the NSO, I decided to reveal my previously anonymous identity and commit to the cause of freedom in Hong Kong. There are many courageous Hong Kongers who refuse to back down despite the risks involved, including those who are in the room today. We persist because we believe human rights and democratic values will ultimately prevail. At a time of rising global authoritarianism, the international community must see the inherent value of a free and democratic Hong Kong. Thank you, Commissioners, for all your continued support. I hope Hong Kongers can count on your allyship as we move forward on our path to freedom and democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kwok. Co-Chairman Merkley has to get back to the Senate for some votes, so I'm very happy to yield to him for any questions he might have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Kern, in your testimony, you call for the United States to provide special immigration pathways for Hong Kongers. It's been a major priority for members of this commission, but frankly, we haven't been making much progress in Congress as a whole. What message does it send if we welcome to our shores the heroes of Hong Kong who are fleeing persecution, and what message does it send if we fail to welcome them?
Well, you may know that up to now, probably something like over 200,000 Hong Kongers have left Hong Kong and gone elsewhere since the imposition of the national security law in 2020. And you've probably heard that the United Kingdom government has started this BNO visa scheme, according to which Hong Kongers who have BNO, British national overseas passports, or are eligible for them, can apply to go to the UK. And for that reason, somewhere around 150,000 Hong Kongers have done that. But there are just so many situations still we find where Hong Kongers who are persecuted directly are having difficulty leaving Hong Kong and finding somewhere where they can go, where they are free. Initially, Taiwan appeared quite receptive to Hong Kongers at risk of persecution, and they seem to have become less so. Hong Kongers who are in Taiwan report frequently that they don't feel very comfortable there. Taiwan is worried about infiltration. It's worried about unnecessarily provoking the PRC and so on. So that's not a very possible route these days. Some Hong Kongers have gone to Canada, some have gone to Australia. But I think it would send a huge message if the United States offered humanitarian pathways to persecuted Hong Kongers. Relatively few Hong Kongers have found themselves in the US since 2020 because it's so hard to get in. My family and I were able to come because of my US passport. And I'll just say that when I arrived in the US in 2020, you know, there are a lot of cliches about freedom. There are a lot of misuses of the word freedom, but I have never felt so free and safe in my life as when I arrived in the US. And that was thanks to my US passport. I would like that opportunity to be available to the relatively limited number of Hong Kongers who really need to get out and feel safe. You know, I mentioned that there are 1,500, nearly 1,500, 1,459 political prisoners in Hong Kong. Those people will be getting out of prison eventually, and they too will need somewhere to go. I think it's something very useful that the U.S. government can do. I know lots of Congress people have been working to make that happen, and I really hope that this will be the congressional session where Congress and the administration can work together to make it a reality.
Thank you. I hope so too, and I'm certainly working towards that goal. Mr. Lai, you talked about the values that made Hong Kong a success: rule of law, freedom of speech, freedom to do business. As these values get picked apart, eroded one by one, what kind of Hong Kong does this leave us going forward? If businesses can no longer rely on robust rule of law and instead are vulnerable to government-sanctioned theft of their assets, like Apple Daily, like your father experienced, shouldn't businesses be rethinking doing business in Hong Kong?
Thank you for your question, sir. The cost of business in Hong Kong has gone up significantly as a result of these institutions being broken down. Yesterday, I had a question from Bloomberg, and they asked me what I thought about doing business in Hong Kong, and I directed to them if you Google Apple Daily raids, I think it gives a very good idea to anybody, a very good visual indication to anybody who's thinking of starting a business in Hong Kong of what can happen at the flip of a switch.
Thank you. And Ms. Kwok, I have 2 minutes left, so this will be my last question. I have many more that I'll submit for the record, but legislative options for opening up humanitarian pathways through Congress right now is not moving forward quickly. It's a big challenge. But what can the Biden administration do under its own authority to step up and do more to assist Hong Kongers fleeing persecution?
Thank you for the question. So in Congress, of course, as I said, designating the priority 2 refugee program is definitely a must. But at the same time, the Biden administration does have the executive authority to upgrade the current DED program, Deferred Enforced Departure Program, to the temporary protected status. And what that would mean would be another layer of protection for Hong Kongers who are already present in the United States. Because as it stands now, the DED does not really give a legal status to any Hong Kongers to stay here. It's merely an executive means to not deport any Hong Kongers, even if they overstay their permitted period. And what that means is sometimes when Hong Kongers are here, they cannot work, they struggle, they have to wait for months for the USCIS to give a federal register for them to be able to work. But then there are a lot of Hong Kongers who are committed in the fight against the regime and want to continue their fights in international institutions, in think tanks, in INGOs, in the civil society. And if they can be granted the TPS, a temporary protected status, they would have a much smoother process, enabling them to work in the United States and also offering them more opportunities to speak up for themselves as they will feel more protected. And on the other hand, in fact, the Biden administration also has the executive power to upgrade the DED status to the P2. And Congress can also legislate for that to happen. And P2 is very important and crucial for Hong Kongers who are still in Hong Kong, because sometimes when they do try to flee to other countries, there might be police in the Hong Kong airport stopping them, especially if they see that the destination is the United States. And that's why the asylum route may not be the most useful for a lot of Hong Kongers who struggle to come to the US directly. And that's why both the TPS and P2 program would be great and significant for Hong Kongers, both who are still inside Hong Kong and in the United States.
Thank you. You mentioned you decided to step out of anonymity in order to be a public voice. To each of you, thank you for your courage, for your fight for freedom, for the rights of Hong Kongers. We stand with you and applaud you. Thank you.
You want to ask a question? Thank you very much, Co-Chair Merkley. I have a number of questions, and I'll ask a few of them, and then yield to my good friend and colleague, Ms. Weston, for any questions she might have. You know, some bad news just came in. It's reported in The Guardian that Hong Kong has passed a law to limit the work of foreign lawyers amid the ongoing Jimmy Lai case. You probably are aware of that, but it's to try to block Tim Owen and any others. It gives an authority to the executive there to block that kind of participation, that kind of representation. So I think that, again, betrays a weakness on the part of their ability to sustain their views in open court, even though it's not an open court, but in a court. So I just would reveal that, or if some of you probably already knew that. But it's very, very discouraging on the part of the Chinese. You know, Sebastian Lai, you had said how disappointed you are about the government of the UK not speaking out. You know, I have many good friends in the Commons and as well as in the House of Lords, and I know David Alton frequently speaks out on behalf of Jimmy Lai. He's tenacious. Ben Rogers does an amazing job as well. While he's not in the legislature, he certainly someone that we look at and rely on for good information and for leadership. I will tell you that we'll initiate a letter today and ask commissioners if they would like to co-sign to the Prime Minister and to high officials, but especially the Prime Minister, appealing for a full-fledged effort to help your dad, Jimmy Lai. I also think they should join us and join us robustly in asking that he and the other 6 total, be named, including Joshua Wong, named by the Nobel Peace Prize Committee to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. You know, back in 2010, I promoted very aggressively that Chen Guangzhen, Gao Zhizhang, and Liu Xiaobo all be named by the Nobel Prize Committee. People around the world were pushing Liu Xiaobo as well, including Václav Havel, and that concerted effort resulted in the 2010 Nobel Peace Prize. And as we all remember, the Chinese government was so insecure they wouldn't even let him get out of prison to attend, or his wife to attend. But I think that has to be done again. I mean, there's no more egregious violator of human rights today than Xi Jinping. And of course, that long arm has now completely been outreached to the great people of Hong Kong. So we'll ask the UK as well, and others, we're doing it already, to join us and others, you, in naming these wonderful, 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 heroic men and women to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. Got to be done. You know, there's human rights violations all over the world, but these are the most egregious, and it's a place where we could make a difference. So we will do that letter today, or put it together and try to get the commissioners, and I know they'll join us in asking that the UK boldly speak out on behalf of your dad and join us in this effort for the Peace Prize awardee. Let me also, if I could, speak to the issue of implementation of the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. I would just say, you know, in 2014, that whole concept was hatched in my office. And the guy that did it, sitting right there. Scott Flipsy came up with this idea for the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. We put it all together. He worked on it. It was a great effort by the commission. And everyone told me on the Foreign Affairs Committee, it's a solution in search of a problem. That, you know, don't worry, Hong Kong will never matriculate from a island or an oasis of democracy to unfortunately, a dictatorship. And we said, you know, it's almost like what Gretzky said. You may not be that aware of his quotes, but he says, always go where the puck's going. Not where it's been, but where it's going. And we got to think ahead. And thank you, Scott. He thought ahead, and we put the bill in, and I couldn't get it passed for 4 years. I tried my darndest. And finally, and I do thank Speaker Pelosi, she helped us get that bill passed. It went over to the Senate. They passed the identical companion bill. It came over again to us, and we sent it down to the president. It's got great things in it, but it has to be implemented. So if I could ask all of you, and Anna, you might want to start, whether or not you think the Biden administration, because you did say, pardon me, I implore the administration, you're not just asking, you're imploring the administration to sanction national security law judges and prosecutors, I would say as well, and that the U.S. government should respond clearly with designated sanctions. Are we doing enough at the executive branch level? And, you know, if I were President Biden sitting right here, what would you say to him and to our Secretary of State? Because, again, we're on the same team, but we need to do more, in my humble opinion. Your thoughts?
For sure. I think the entire Hong Kong committee, or the majority of the Hong Kong committee, would agree that sanctions is not utilized enough, to the extent that actually the Hong Kong government officials are not so scared of sanctions anymore. They think, oh, perhaps the bills or the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act is just here for show. And that is why I implore the administration really utilize the tools that were hard fought by advocates in 2019 and 2020, with hundreds of thousands of Hong Kongers going to the street just to thank the U.S. Congress for passing the bill and having sanctioning policies in place. So right now, as we speak, it is actually the 57th day of the largest series of national security law trial that involves more than 40 pro-democracy leaders in Hong Kong right now. If we do not impose sanctions, targeted sanctions against persecutors, against judges, handpicked by Beijing before the trial ends, we can perhaps expect to see potential life sentencing on some of the most familiar names we have been seeing for the last decade. And that is why I think we are actually really battling and competing with time right now. If we don't do it early enough, soon there won't be any momentum anymore, and it will be a train that we'll miss forever. And that's why I really implore President Biden, the administration, and also Congress to exert more pressure on the administration for further sanctions to be in place.
Sebastian.
Yep. On a personal level, in my father's case, the Biden administration, the White House, has been a lot more vocal than Downing Street. So thank you very much for. I think the letter would be absolutely incredible help in raising my father's case to the UK. So I want them to. I want the White House also know that we're incredibly grateful for these for this, and it does show that the ideas of freedom of speech and all these institutions are much more sacred in the United States than in countries where people don't speak up for their own citizens. In terms of what I'd ask the Biden administration to do more is to continue to speak out for what's happening to the people of Hong Kong and to my father, as in Hong Kong they no longer have a voice, sadly. And to actively seek for my father's and other political prisoners' release, because it's the just and fair thing to do. They have not committed any crimes. Thank you.
Yeah, perhaps first I should say that I consider the US government to be one of the actors that's been the best when it comes to Hong Kong compared to its Western allies. I give it a lot of credit for that. And I'm not just talking about the current administration, the previous one as well as many people in Congress on both sides of the aisle. As I said in my opening statement, that's incredibly heartening. I'm sure you all know that when the US speaks, the world listens. And any leadership that the administration can take is important. My main message is hold the line. Right now, we're seeing signs of slippage from some European countries. You know, I was really hoping that after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that would be a big wake-up call. And Western democracies would say, look, it's not a good idea to be economically dependent on ideological adversaries, dictatorships as powerful as the Communist Party. I'm not sure that awareness has really, been transformed into China policy in some countries in Europe. So the US really needs to keep showing leadership on that. I think one of the very positive things about this administration is they've tried to improve alliances with their allies, and that's extremely important to act together. But I think it's an area where the US will have to show leadership. Anna especially, I think, has a lot of excellent specific policy recommendations and things that can be done. But one thing I should say is that both the previous administration and the current one have sanctioned various Communist Party and Hong Kong government officials and top Hong Kong police officers. Make those sanctions stick. We've heard rumors that the administration may actually be considering allowing Chief Executive John Lee to attend the APEC summit in November, even though he's sanctioned by the US government. That absolutely should not happen. If it does, it will send a terrible message. It will basically mean sanctions mean nothing. So that's why I say hold the line, no backsliding. Anything you can do to lead a coalition of Western democracies that will take a strong stance on China. That will be very important. But at this specific time, I really think it's an area where the U.S. has to follow through.
Thank you. Kevin, did you want to say anything? Our man in Australia?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The thing is, look, as a Hong Kong lawyer, it's never easy to say that you should sanction a fellow professional, whether in the form of a prosecutor or a judge. And if those guys were doing nothing more than going through the motions, I probably would have gone through with that reluctance. But the reality is, whether we are talking about certain of the national security judges or some of the prosecutors in political cases, we're talking about people who have gone above and beyond to persecute, to uphold a political line. We're talking about people who've been fabulously rewarded with promotions, with orders of merit, with chief executive commendations, you name it. So if that's the case, why should the United States allow these people to have access to the global financial system? Why should the United States allow these people's children to come and enjoy the best of free world education when young men and women in Hong Kong are being put through re-education, through patriotic education, through imprisonment, and so on? So with some reluctance, I would say that, let's do it. And I absolutely also echo what Brian had said in relation to John Lee. It would send a terrible message if the United States lifts sanctions against him and let him into San Francisco come November for APEC. So I take the view that the conduct of these judges and prosecutors, Hong Kong made them just as they made me, right? It's the rule of law made our careers, but they're destroying the very thing that made our careers, and therefore I don't see why they shouldn't be sanctioned.
Because of your suggestions, we will follow that up with the administration and ask that they not provide that. It's been my, lessons learned. I've been in Congress now 43 years, and human rights laws often are a nuisance to any administration, Republican or Democrat. I wrote the Belarus Democracy Act that was enacted into law in 2004. Lukashenko, and you mentioned him, that's what prompted that, Mr. Kern, a dictator, horrible, put all these people in prison, tortured them horribly in Belarus. We got the bill passed. Some of the prisoners got out. And then all of a sudden there was a sense, and this is during the Bush administration, well, we made our point, now we can move on and go back to business as usual. So I said, absolutely. So I did a 2006 iteration of the act, did it again in 2012, and then again a couple of years ago. There's always that sense that we made our point, but until these great people are free and human rights are respected, we have not made our point. We've just done a down payment on getting there. So thank you all for making that very important point. We can't get human rights fatigue and say, now let's go back to business as usual. And I'm always worried. I see it all the time, no matter who's in the White House. So this commission, in a bipartisan way, will try to stand up. One final question. We'll have a few more in the second round, but to Sebastian Lai, what is the day like, average day for your father? How does he get through it? Is it his faith that helps buoy his persistence and his courage? How does he do it?
So because of the national security law, I haven't seen him since the end of 2020. Unfortunately, from my understanding, my father knows he's doing the right thing. He's a deeply religious man, and I think he's keeping strong.
I'd like to yield to Jennifer Wexton, Commissioner.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses for being here too. I know that this is really hard for you. I know that a lot of, probably your families are probably facing a lot of trouble as a result of your testimony here today. So thank you so much for all your work that you've been doing. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you so much for your long history with human rights here in Congress. I know that you kind of think of you as the Iron Man of human rights in the House of Representatives. Glad you continue to do it because somebody needs to hold these administrations accountable. We need to have that institutional memory, and I'm so glad to hear that you have it. That you worked a lot with my predecessor, Representative Wolf, on these issues. I'm very proud to continue in his story. It's great to be here. I want to thank everybody for coming again, and I have some questions for you. I was a lawyer before I came here. I was also a prosecutor in Loudoun County. I was also a judge for a while. So seeing what's happening in Hong Kong is very frightening to me as somebody who grew up here in the principles of constitutional law, of rule of law, and just seeing the basic inalienable rights that we have here in this country. Things like right to free speech, right to assembly, things like that, which are non-existent for the Hong Kongers now. Really scary to see that this happened right before our eyes over the past several years. I feel for you. I feel for you, Anna. I feel for you that you can't go back to your country and just enjoy life as a free person. So I feel really bad about that. But I want to thank everybody for being here. I want to have some questions about that. So my first question is, one of the things that I find most frightening about this new security law is that they have this whole idea of extraterritorial jurisdiction, where they can come after people and prosecute them for things that they do in other places, in places that aren't China, aren't Hong Kong, and aren't their own country, for the things that they do here in the U.S. or in the UK. So do you have any instances of people being actually brought back to the China or be prosecuted in Hong Kong for things that they did when they weren't in Hong Kong? Instances of that, or is it more of a threat that they have?
Recently, there was a Hong Konger student who used to study in Japan, and she wanted to go back to Hong Kong to renew her passport. And once she stepped onto the soil of Hong Kong, she got arrested for something she did and she said in Japan, which was simply organizing to talk about Hong Kong and to advocate for the stories and freedoms for Hong Kong. So that's been happening, I think, in many instances, and usually anonymous protesters or, organizers who do not really have a high public profile are the most susceptible to this kind of persecutions and arrests, because a lot of the times they try to be helpful when they're outside, and it's very difficult to gauge where the red line is. You never know, what is the bottom line when you're being monitored or surveilled by the Hong Kong offices, especially when they're in countries with HAETOs, the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Offices. And that is why it's not only about the NSO, actually. It's not only the national security law, but all the other, freedom of speech, freedom of expression have been greatly limited because of how the Hong Kong government actually tries to monitor Hong Kongers overseas. But I guess perhaps Brian and Sebastian may have other cases that you would want to bring forward as well.
Another case, Sebastian? Another example?
Yeah, so the case about the Hong Kong student studying in Japan is the one that happened the most recently, and really the boldest one, so to speak, because it was just a few social media posts that she liked. Another thing I wanted to point out about the national security law, just to add to this, is that the national security law was, when it was first introduced, it wasn't meant to be retroactive, as in what happened before national security law wasn't meant to be something that you could get charged for, and obviously that is not the case. So you have this incredibly broad law that covers the world and time, which makes it so much more.
It's very frightening.
Poisonous.
Yeah, it is absolutely very scary. Thank you
Yeah.
so much. Brian, do you have any examples?
I think the thing I'd like to stress is that the way authoritarian regimes operate is largely through threat. If they're successful, they'll threaten much more than they'll follow through on it. So what happens with something like this is it conditions people's behavior. Obviously, that's the case for people who are trapped in Hong Kong. We often say Hong Kong's one big prison. There are the 1,459 political prisoners actually sitting in prison. Then there are the ones in Hong Kong, which is a pretty small territory. But it affects people beyond that as well. Anna pointed out she made a decision at one point to cease to be anonymous. For people sitting on this panel, they're not going to go back to Hong Kong unless they want to go to prison. So that's the position that every single Hong Kong person living outside of Hong Kong finds themselves in. Do I allow my face to be shown? Do I show up in public? Do I go to protests? Do I talk to the papers? Because if I do, then I better not go back to Hong Kong. I want to see my family in Hong Kong. am I really going to take that risk? So that's what I mean. As much as like specific instances like the Hong Kong student in Japan, it's the way it affects Hong Kong people living abroad.
Right.
And of course, that is by design. It's by intention. I often think of the national security law as not so much a law as a blueprint for control. It's meant to control people. It's meant to control their behavior. So we see that, I think, throughout the diaspora. Everyone goes through those kinds of calculations when they think about what role they're going to play and whether or not they can appear publicly.
This is the same thing that they've done with Uyghurs and with Tibetans as well. Exact same thing. And I know because I have a lot of Uyghur constituents in my district who have told me about instances where they've gotten a call and they've just said, we got grandma here and she'd love to talk to you via WhatsApp, but she'd like to talk to her. And then they'll talk to her and she'll be like from the PRC sitting right next to her on the sofa, and she's like, everything's fine here. Really scary. You guys still have, everybody still has family in Hong Kong, I would imagine. So that's really frightening and it's really bad for you. So in your view, have U.S. government sanctions, have they actually worked? Have they actually worked at all? Government sanctions, have they worked at all, Mr. Curran? I know you said something about them.
It depends on what you mean by work. I often hear people complain and say, oh, the sanctions aren't working. And when they say that, what they seem to mean is that they have not changed the behavior of the people sanctioned.
Right.
Obviously, that's one way of figuring out whether sanctions are working. But I can say 100% certain sanctions have a hugely positive effect symbolically. And you might say symbols don't mean anything, and I would disagree. They have a huge effect. It heartens Hong Kong people in Hong Kong to see that the US government recognizes what these people in Hong Kong and the Communist Party are doing to them. Not only that, but as a campaigner or as an activist, it's very powerful to be able to say, you should not be associating with this guy, John Lee. He is sanctioned by the US government. That sort of thing really matters. And in that sense, I think sanctions are very important and quite effective, whether or not they directly affect the behavior of the individuals sanctioned. And that's why it's so important, once you sanction somebody, to hold the line and be firm on that. And I totally agree with everyone else on this panel who say that the U.S. should consider further sanctions, especially on national security law prosecutors and judges, as well as prosecutors and judges involved in other political trials in Hong Kong.
Thank you very much. And you kind of anticipated one of my other questions, which was are the other Western countries helping out with this at all? Are the Western countries helping out with allowing in more refugees and stuff like that from Hong Kong or anybody?
So you're not just talking about sanctions; you're also
Talking
talking about other areas.
Everything. Are they helping us? Are they helping us to show that it's just this security law is bad and that we don't stand with the Hong Kongers? Is there any other Western country that's helping us besides the UK?
Well, I think that we were just mentioning, I think before you came in, that the United Kingdom government has started this new British National Overseas Visa Scheme, which allows Hong Kongers who have a British National Overseas Passport or are eligible for it to come to Hong Kong on a 5-year plan that can lead to permanent residency come to the UK to do that. And 150,000 Hong Kongers have availed themselves of that. That's a very concrete and important measure that the UK...
Is that most people who are living in Hong Kong at the time of the switchover? Most people who are living there?
Yeah, so since the imposition of the national security law, the UK government said that the Chinese government has violated the Joint Sino-British Declaration, and therefore we're enacting this visa scheme. That's a very concrete measure. I think a lot of Western governments have said the right things. And that doesn't, it's important for them to say the right things. Canada and Australia have enacted certain pathways to make it easier for some Hong Kongers to go to those places. that's useful. But I was also saying that I'm afraid that there's a bit of a sea change happening where some Western governments are going back to the bad old days where trade pretty much dictates China policy. I think the US was caught in that trap for decades, actually, and I'm very encouraged by the changes in US-China policy over the last few years. And I mentioned that I think the US needs to continue to play a leading role in that policy and work with its allies on that. I think the US can have a very positive influence on some of its Western allies as regards China policy, Hong Kong policy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've definitely overstayed my welcome here. Back to the second round. Thank you.
I'd like to now yield to Commissioner Nunn.
Mr. Chair, thank you very much, and appreciate this committee coming together to have what is a very important conversation on the Chinese Communist Party's not only takeover but crackdown with this national security law that they've placed in Hong Kong. First of all, I want to begin, Mr. Lay, thank you so much for spending time with us today, for the sacrifice that your family has made, for the imprisonment of your father today, for speaking, for being a voice for the people of Hong Kong, for practicing his faith. He now, as you highlighted, in turn, with very little extrajudicial capability to be able to appeal this. We here in the United States stand with you in unwavering support to the rule of law, to the right of free expression, the support of democracy in the face of adversity. Look, I'm from a small state of Iowa, and if we were to look at what Hong Kong went through in almost an overnight experience, the capturing of 7 million lives and taking away those fundamental things that here in America Jefferson highlighted as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and muzzled in an instant. It would be the equivalent of Iowa, Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, all in the case of an evening being transitioned from being a bastion of hope, a place that Asia could look to for freedom, for a voice, for a rule of law, both in its judges, but also in an exemplary police force that has now been used as a baton to crack down on individuals who have stood up. I mention those states in the heart of the heartland because, as Mr. Kern just highlighted, they were the states to help stand up and fight back against China's repression. When we took a personal hit in Iowa by doing trade negotiations, it meant that our farmers didn't get to sell pork and soybean to a very lucrative market. But it was far more important that we stood up to China now than afford them the ability to continue to bully not just their neighbors, but the entire world. The people of Hong Kong are proven friends, and it's clear today with so many of you here how important this is to your families and to the future of your families. As trade partners, as allies with the United States, you deserve to enjoy this fundamental right that we've experienced here in the West. But what the Chinese Communist Party has done by implementing its national security law in Hong Kong has effectively crushed not just the freedom, but it's punished individual expression, it's destroyed civil liberties, and it's taken away the promise that was made that these individuals would have the opportunity to have a fair and autonomous life. Overnight, the CCP betrayed not just the people of Hong Kong, but it lied bold-faced to the rest of the world in its ambition. It is difficult to work with partners that we want to find an on-ramp with, like China. But when they tell the United States to our face that they're not flying surveillance balloons over the West Coast, that they're not actively looking to arm, that they're not intrinsically suppressing their own people, I can only imagine the difficulty for those in Hong Kong today to be able to trust their own government. So with that, Mr. Lay, I'd like to begin with you. Due to the mass crackdown of civil liberties and the people of Hong Kong who are fleeing their home country today, as many we see in this room, in what ways can the United States create really a more welcoming place for these individuals to call home? We've learned not just sanctions are effective, but that there can be a carrot on this opportunity. Maybe as what was highlighted from the British visa plan to help those, particularly those intellectuals who want to leave Hong Kong, find a new home in America.
Thank you, sir. Look, the people of Hong Kong are a incredibly well-educated, bilingual or trilingual labor force. So really, they are an asset to any country that can get enough of them in. And so I think, as you alluded to, a easier visa requirement. Now, it's not my area of expertise, but a easier visa requirement for especially for those who are politically persecuted, but for all those who want to leave to the US, and many of them want to move to the US because I think fundamentally with how the US has treated this case, there is much love for the US in Hong Kong, especially among those who love freedom, which is I think most people. So that's all I know to say on this, but yeah, thank you.
No, and Mr. Lai, I think one of the key aspects of this is for those who have made it to the West to continue to be a voice for those who remain behind, to be a clear channel of information, being able to describe what's happening in Hong Kong today under this national security apparatus that's really enslaving its own community.
Yeah.
Ms. Kawak, would like to speak to you on this, call it propaganda, call it dangerous doublespeak coming out of China today. The reality is, as a military member who's served counterintelligence operations inside China, you see a very different speak on what is said to the West and then what is done inside China. Specifically, the CCP has become a master of rhetorical influence, and they're doing this in a variety of mediums. Can you please share with us from your experience some of the ways the Communist Party has really promoted a pro-authoritarian narrative that's influencing even some within Hong Kong to be subversive to Beijing and willfully give up their own rights?
Thank you for the question. I think you're right that the Chinese Communist Party is certainly expert in really mending people's mind and creating different languages to cater to different audience. And from my time in the United States, I've observed that the CCP has done so on American soil as well. For example, firstly, through the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Offices, which have offices in DC, New York City, and San Francisco, they consistently organize events with civil society partners, art galleries, film festivals, to talk about the story of Hong Kong. But of course, the kind of story they're talking about is a prosperous Hong Kong that never had any human rights abuses. And we know is not true. But for some American members of the public who just want to watch a film, they would not understand, the very complex dynamics behind, and they would easily absorb the rhetoric that Hong Kong is back to business, while in fact it is not. And secondly, I think one thing that has been getting more traction in Congress and in general public is about TikTok. TikTok has been proven to have a way for people or staff members in mainland China to access and also manipulate the algorithm for the version in the United States. And that is definitely something to look out for, because that is what the CCP thrives at doing, is having all these subtle traces and subtle ways to really plant people's plant ideas into people's mind that are useful or manipulative enough to support the regime. And that have been happening in Hong Kong for the past 26 years with national education, patriotic education. A lot of propaganda materials have been used in kindergarten and primary schools to kids to tell them to love China. I exactly went through that sort of education, but not as much or as serious or as intense as kids in Hong Kong right now. And that is why it's also important to keep free internet open, access open in Hong Kong, even though right now there's virtually a firewall inside of Hong Kong. For example, HKDC's website is blocked in Hong Kong and censored. But still, I think the Hong Kong government does not dare to really have a full firewall built up as it is in the mainland China right now. But even with that, they're blocking websites arbitrarily, one by one every day. And what we can do is, previously there was a bill in Congress on keeping Hong Kong's internet freedom safe and free for Hong Kongers to access. And I urge the Congress to reconsider that kind of legislation and see how we can keep internet access open in Hong Kong. And that is the only space Hong Kongers have right now to continue engaging in a discussion on freedom and democracy.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ms. Kwok, and thank you for advocacy on this very, very important issue. Mr. Carr, I'm going to turn to you briefly here. You know, we look at what's going on in the rest of the world right now. We see crackdowns in Iran. We see a repressive state, not just in Russia, but in Eastern Europe. These have been very in our face, physical, military operations almost. In China, they're approaching it in a different path, but clearly with very similar effect. Hong Kong, the perfect example, the threat to Taiwan, very obvious to anyone who's watching right now. Could you deep dive with us briefly on the things that Beijing has done to effectively subjugate Hong Kong in such a short period of time that has really ripped away some of these fundamental freedoms that were enjoyed for decades prior to this, with really not a shot even being fired, but almost more effective than what we're seeing in other repressive regimes?
When you need to shoot your own people, it's a sign you've failed. That, I think, is a Communist Party dictate. You know, one of the things about the Communist Party is that it's so strong that it doesn't often need to go out in the streets and shoot its own people. The last time it did that in very large numbers was 1989 at the Tiananmen massacre. And I think that was one of the things the party learned was do everything you can so as to not have to resort to that. So what you see in Hong Kong is that they turn the screws as they need to. They imposed the national security law. They arrested a lot of people. They waited to see what followed. They were disappointed that not enough Hong Kong people stopped speaking, stopped saying what they didn't want to hear. And so they drug out this old colonial era from the UK colonial period sedition law. Now, I don't know what sedition means to you, but in Hong Kong, it's basically a speech crime. So there was reference today to these 5 young trade unionists who published 3 allegorical children's books about sheep. They were arrested and tried under sedition and sentenced to 19 months in prison each. So there have been 77 arrests on sedition charges now. Jimmy Lai is also going to be tried on sedition as well as under the national security law. And I think virtually all of these people, it's because they were journalists. They're 2 editors from a very respected publication that also has been forced to close like Apple Daily called Stand News. They're both on trial for sedition. Many people who are on trial for sedition, it's for online comments they've made on social media. So that's what I mean. They turn that screw and they look around and they say, have enough people been silenced? Are we satisfied? If not, then they find other screws to turn. And their objective is to silence people because propaganda really isn't very effective unless it's accompanied by censorship. If people have the right to say what they think, you've got competing voices, and it's very hard for propaganda to win out at the end of the day. In China, they've really perfected that combination of propaganda and censorship. And in Hong Kong, they're trying to find exactly what the right mix is so that essentially they can turn it into China.
Imagine a situation in which George Orwell is arrested for writing Animal Farm. Unfortunately, it sounds like in Hong Kong today, fiction is now fact. And that's exactly what we see. These individuals who are trying to illustrate the challenge are now becoming the victim of a police state. I want to thank you all very much for your testimony today and know that you have a strong ally on a bipartisan, bicameral effort to be able to stand with Hong Kong and the work that you're trying to do to stand up to the CCP. Mr. Chair, I cannot thank you enough for leading on this effort.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Nunn, and thank you for the background you bring to this, which is extraordinary and unique. Let me just a couple of other questions, and then I'll yield to my colleagues if they have any further questions. First of all, I was just thinking in follow-up to this hearing that we're going to put together a resolution asking the Nobel Peace Prize Committee we will appeal to them. They can't be told what to do, and that's the way it should be. We will appeal to them to award it to the 6 people, beginning with Jimmy Lai, that are on the list that this commission has recommended, the co-chairs and the ranking members. We've asked them to do that. Back in 2010, I did the same thing with Liu Xiaobo and Chen Guangchen and Gao Zhizhang. Liu Xiaobo did get it, so I'll never forget sitting there when they had the empty seat. It just spoke volumes about, and then they wouldn't even let his wife, as I said earlier, as we all know, attend as well. But I think this is the most opportune time to reassert this. So we'll do a House resolution on this and begin drafting it today. Secondly, Mr. Kern, you talked briefly about the issue of trade. And as an exporting country, we know that China is absolutely reliant on trade to sustain its military, the Chinese Communist Party. And, there's a whole lesson that was not learned back when, after Tiananmen Square, and I would fault Herbert Walker Bush and then Bill Clinton for their appeal to China to say nothing to see here. Brent Scowcroft, as we all know, made an infamous trip over to reassure them post Tiananmen Square. And then Bill Clinton got it right at first and even accused Bush of coddling dictatorship. And then he coddled like no one else. In May 26, 1994, he delinked human rights from trade. I actually went to Beijing with a letter in hand signed by 100 members, bipartisan members, met with the foreign ministry. And they told me it was January before they would be up for the review period for MFN delinkage. They said, we're getting it. I said, well, we've got names here. And I called Warren Christopher as soon as I got back, who's the Secretary of State. And I said, they think you're bluffing. And we were. And I think that we lost such leverage. I think we would have a different China today if not on May 26, 1994, on a Friday afternoon where everybody had left this place to go back to their districts, as they should. I was still here lingering. I went over and did a press conference that C-SPAN carried. It's still on their website if you ever want to check it out. But it was like, oh, how could we have given up that leverage? Well, we need to regain it. I've introduced a bill that would relink MFN with trade, the PTNTR, as they call it now, with a number of lists of categories, including political prisoners. And my hope is, and I've met with the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, and I've talked to others, I'm not sure we'll get it passed or whether or not it would ever be signed, but we need to be moving in that direction. We need conditionality and not trade in an unfettered way that enables a dictatorship to just absolutely maltreat its own people, and like your dad. So we're pursuing that, but I appreciate, Mr. Kern, that you brought that up, because trade is. I remember meeting with the Chamber of Commerce in Beijing on one of the many trips, and some of those were taken with your predecessor, Frank Wolf, who was a great champion of human rights. And there was one Foreign Service officer from the State Department sitting there who was very junior grade. They had all these commercial experts in our embassy flocking around, and a lot of people from the Chamber of Commerce. And they all said, we trade, my words, paraphrase, they matriculate from dictatorship to democracy. And I said, nothing could be further from the truth. They'll get more powerful and more dictatorial, and they'll have the means to carry it out with more impunity and more effectiveness. So hopefully we've learned that lesson. I'm not sure we have, but we need to keep trying. And this panel certainly helps. Your leadership, all of you, helps really significantly. Mr. Kern, you mentioned that 13-year-old. What was he or she charged with? You remember?
It was a very complicated case. There was an incident in which it was during the protests, and plainclothes police officers saw that some protesters were blocking a road, and the protesters noticed them. And this was actually a lot of flashpoints during the protest happened because of plainclothes police officers who would often dash out and grab people and wrestle them to the ground and beat them. And so protesters were very much on guard against this sort of thing. And a couple of the plainclothes police officers were surrounded by some protesters, and the protesters were haranguing them and saying, "You're cops, you shouldn't be here," that sort of thing. So he and I want to say 5 others were on trial for false imprisonment. The idea was that they had essentially imprisoned these police officers because they weren't allowing them to go. And then I think a couple of them were charged with assaulting the police officers. I think there was a skirmish between them. So that boy, upon conviction, was remanded in custody, and his sentencing, along with that of the others, will be in a week to 10 days. And he will most likely, there are 3 types of juvenile detention in Hong Kong, and for children that young, he'll get some kind of juvenile detention sentence, which can last up to 3 years.
I'd just ask if any of you would like to speak to the issue of how the prisoners are treated. Do they have access, particularly if they're American or UK, to consular affairs personnel to do welfare and whereabouts types of, the welfare visit to make sure that they're being treated, well, which is probably an oxymoron. But do they have that kind of access? And if I could also ask Ms. Kwok, especially you, we know that transnational repression is on the rise, and we're working on legislation that try to address it. I think the administration is very well aware of it, and they're speaking out as well. How are your leaders, how are you treated when it comes to this surveillance state that comes here and then they look to intimidate and harass?
So some personal anecdotes that I can provide would include, for example, when the Hong Kong Democracy Council or DC4HA, other Hong Kongers in the DMV area try to organize protests, sometimes we would find cameras pointed at us. And of course, there's no way we can verify who these people are, but they would refuse to speak to us. And sometimes they actually walked directly from the HAETO offices. So we can tell very clearly that they belong to the HAETOs. And separately, it's about HAETO officers asking Hong Kongers in the DMV area about personal information on members of my team. And of course, that would constitute transnational repression because they're trying to spread fear and trying to get personal information that they do not necessarily need just to, intimidate activists and advocates working on this issue. And previously, there are other Hong Kong community members in Boston, in the Cornell area in New York State, who have been beaten or intimidated by various, we don't know who they are. But for example, the DOJ actually released some report just a few days ago about one of them being actually spies from the Chinese Communist Party who were intentionally intimidating one of the activists, I believe, who is here with us today. So there are many instances of transnational repression, but because it's not a very known or openly discussed subject in the past, I think we're still discovering and finding out cases of transnational repression. And in order to help Hong Kongers in the US who to continue their advocacy, I really suggest to have faster humanitarian pathways for Hong Kongers so that they can feel safer, and even expediting asylum cases especially for individuals who have been intimidated, threatened, or injured by transnational repression. And on the other hand, again, I would have to emphasize the need for the HAE2 Certification Act, which would really have to evaluate the presence and the statuses and privileges by the HAETOs, as well as what they have been doing here in the United States.
Just to add to that, the transnational repression isn't necessarily a new thing for Hong Kong and China, and it's especially not just limited to the people of Hong Kong. You see a lot of an example of this is the secret police stations that are dotted all across the world. Another more perverse example is with students at universities, at Western universities, being spied on by fellow students, and they report back to the embassy. And those students, a lot of those students end up having issues back in their country.
Perhaps I can take the question. Perhaps I can take the question on consular access for prisoners. I know of a number of cases in Hong Kong, including parochially, one Australian citizen in the 47 political activist case that is currently on trial, that China's view is that a lot of these guys, because they have both Hong Kong residency as well as a foreign citizenship, that they deem these people as Chinese nationals, and therefore they're not entitled to consular access. So I know that there are a number of those cases around where political prisoners, people in remand, are denied access by their home country's consular officials.
Mr. Kern.
In regard to that with U.S. Citizens who are political prisoners in Hong Kong, the U.S. consulate in Hong Kong typically says that these are private matters. And so we know very little about this. I'm not aware of any particular cases. There are some where it's a little bit uncertain whether the individual in question is a U.S. citizen. So I do not know the extent to which the U.S. consulate in Hong Kong is following up on that. The families of these individuals have also chosen not to speak out, and so none of these cases have really become public knowledge. You also asked about the prisons. And the thing to keep in mind about Hong Kong is it's in transition from a liberal to an authoritarian society. And when it is, a lot of elements are kind of up in the air. So with the Hong Kong police, for example, it's perfectly clear that they've essentially been transformed into a militia to enforce the will of the Communist Party. And there's this huge new national security department within the Hong Kong police force. There are Chinese secret police now operating in Hong Kong because of the national security law. It's entirely secret. We don't know how they're cooperating with the Hong Kong police and so on. The prisons are not run by the police. They're run by the Correctional Services Department, which, like so many civil services in Hong Kong, have through the years functioned fairly well and fairly efficiently. The kinds of abuses you see in many authoritarian countries like Belarus, where people are horribly tortured and even killed in prison, you do not see in Hong Kong. There have been some questions on the issue of solitary confinement of political prisoners, and it's been very difficult to get good information about that. The CSD said in those cases that those prisoners have voluntarily decided to confine themselves solitarily, and we're not sure about that. So we're keeping an eye on what's happening in the prisons. We don't have a good monitoring system to find out whether all political prisoners are getting out when their sentences have expired. So there's a lot of gray areas in Hong Kong now that have become more difficult to monitor because of the situation there.
On that, Mr. Kern, has the ICRC, International Committee of Red Cross, have they tried to get into the prisons?
Not that I know of.
I also want to add one more thing to the discussion is that Sammy Bickett, who's sitting behind me, was actually in Hong Kong's prison for two times and a few weeks, and he's a United States citizen who was working in Hong Kong as a lawyer at the time. And during his time in prison, he said that he did get some consular visits, and more often than perhaps other people. And eventually, of course, it's great that he's back into the U.S. safely. But of course, I think as the U.S. consulate in Hong Kong is also navigating, honestly, in this muddy water. And I would also suggest the U.S. consulate in Hong Kong to increase communication with American businesses in Hong Kong, as sometimes they are complicit in human rights abuses. And that can be monitored through the Hong Kong Business Integrity and Transparency
And
Act.
do you know if they allow ministers to come in, like religious leaders to visit and attend to the spiritual needs?
I'm not aware of these visits.
They have this category called justices of the peace, and many high-profile citizens can become justices of the peace. Cardinal Zen, whom you nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize very deservedly, he's been one of the people who very consistently goes and visits a very wide range of political prisoners, from the very well-known to some of these kids who get very little attention. So there are people like him who are still doing that, yes.
Commissioner Weston?
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. And, you know, when you're telling us about what happened in 1984, it definitely, again, calls to mind just how good it is to have you on this committee, because to have you here as a chairman, because you have this institutional knowledge like nobody else. It's great to have you here. I have to say, I agree with you that giving repressive regimes more power and more ability to interact with the world does not make them any less repressive. In fact, it makes them more repressive. We've seen that happen here in China. They certainly raised repression to an art form here, where they can not only repress Taiwan and Tibet and everybody. I feel that it's just really bad, and I just feel like they started with Tibet, and now they need to move on to Xinjiang and to Hong Kong now. And now I think that Taiwan is the next and last, hopefully, on their agenda. So we just need to do what we can to stop it. This doesn't seem to be stopping, and so I think that it would be good to get conditionality back into the trade. I think at that point, Mr. Chairman, I do feel the horse left the barn. At this point, it's a lot harder to get the horse back into the barn or the camel out of the tent once it's in there. So it's going to be a lot harder. I agree with you that we need to do something, because we can't just stand by and let this happen. I'm relatively new to Congress. This is my 5th year here. So sometimes I don't understand why I can't do things that make so much sense, right? I know there's a lot of reasons. I know there's a lot of moving parts and everything. And maybe, Mr. Chairman, you can elucidate me about why we can't do things like just change the status for relatively quick fixes, like changing status to TPS, right? Because I mean, I can't think of a better time to do it than now, because people who definitely can't go home, I mean, they can't go home. They might as well be able to work here and just stay here as long as they can. Be protected. Does not be worried that they can be kicked out at any moment. Very scary. But when you think about why that is, I just try to think about why. There's a lot of moving parts here. A big part of it is China's power. It's like economic power. Yes, we're addicted to these cheap goods, right? You see every day things like Shein coming into the picture. People buy boxes and boxes of clothes for like $10 and $20. They can buy these disposable clothes, and the reason that they're able to buy them for so cheap is because they're made with forced labor, made with exploited resources. You know, that's why they're able to undercut the rest of the world. We just eat it up. We can't get enough of it, and it's really a problem. Now they've got TikTok, which is even worse. You know, TikTok is even scarier to me. Is something where they really have a conduit for propaganda. They also have a lot of willing people who are giving them all their data. So then they have a conduit for their propaganda. They have a bunch of data about Americans. They know whereabouts, what we do. You know, they know what we like, what we don't like, what our bank accounts are, everything. I mean, you name it. You know, all the information. So it's a really big problem. I think we got to do something about that as well. But you know, when we had our Energy and Commerce had hearings about TikTok, you would have thought that we were going to sacrifice a bunch of kittens and puppies on the steps of the Capitol. people reacted. It was insane. People were like, don't take away our TikTok. Insane. We got threats and all kinds of horrible, horrible things. It's very, very frightening what they've done. We need to see what we can do to make it better. But one of the things, one of the questions I have for you is, what do you consider the new normal in Taiwan? I know that they had mass crackdowns about things like the umbrella movement and things like that. And mass crackdowns over time as people have become more protesting in public. You feel that those mass protests will return again? That people will be able to protest in mass way, and then they'll have more mass attention? Do you think the new normal is just surveilling people mercilessly and then picking up people one at a time? I think the new normal is going to be in Hong Kong. And I'll start with you. Sebastian, why don't you introduce your head?
Yeah, I think the Hong Kong government and indeed the China government has really gone on a war with information. So I think regarding mass protests in Hong Kong, if you lock down the system, just communicating with others, and you have surveillance over that, then it's very hard to gather any idea of a mass protest from understanding. So I think at some point the Hong Kong government realized that actually the loudest sound of oppression isn't tear gas, guns, batons. It's silence, and I think that's where we are in Hong Kong at the moment. Silence.
Very sad.
I also want to echo to something that you said earlier about how it happened to Tibetans, to Uyghurs, and now to Hong Kongers. And next, perhaps, we are worried about Taiwanese democracy. And I think in the past 2 years, Congress has actually taken a pretty constructive take and approach by increasing America's competitiveness, and also how America can kind of limit the supply chain so that America can continue a sort of allyship with democratic countries like Taiwan. And I know there are currently talks of, another round of perhaps something to follow up on USICA and Competes Act from last year, which became the CHIPS Act in the end. And actually in last year's conferencing, there were extensive provisions for Hong Kongers, Tibetans, and Uyghurs, and also concerning humanitarian pathways as well, because in the certain provisions and drafts of the bill, it was understood that perhaps having more freedom fighters who fought with the regimes would actually increase some sort of competitiveness here domestically in the U.S. And I would urge that if this year this package is going into discussion again, I hope that there can be provisions attached with regards to protecting Uyghurs, Tibetans, and Hong Kongers in the United States, as well as increasing a sort of competitiveness together with Taiwan, and hopefully that can eventually help us dilute some sort of human rights abuses happening in Hong Kong.
Anybody else have anything else that they want to add?
I think there's a lot of talk about, especially in the Western world's foreign policy establishment, national security establishment, that Hong Kong is a lost cause and that everyone should move to the next line of defense of Taiwan. Now, obviously, there are measures that are specific in relation to Taiwan that Western governments, including the United States, should be taking. But on the other hand, given that Hong Kong's one country, two systems model was set up as an example to be applied on Taiwan, if the Western world decides that they're going to abandon Hong Kong and think that, if we abandon Hong Kong, we can just put all our efforts into Taiwan, then that actually emboldens China to think that they can get away with oppression, that they can get away with doing whatever they want, and that far from helping the Western world in focusing on Taiwan, giving up on Hong Kong is actually going to embolden China to take a more aggressive line in relation to Taiwan and make it much more difficult for the Western world to hold the line.
Thank you very much. It's great advice, and I agree. I really agree with you. Thank you so much. I thank the witnesses for being here today. This was really fascinating. I'm sorry that you guys have to go through this, but hopefully we can help in some way. Thank you so much. Take care.
I do want to thank our very distinguished witnesses for your leadership each and every day. You help us. We work together, but you are really guiding lights for this commission as to our next steps and what we need to do. So thank you so very, very much. The hearing is adjourned.